Welcome, everyone. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. Today we are gathering for the Friday lecture, Servitude, Afterlives, and the Demands of History in the Present with Professor Mareike Winchell. Kindly note that because this is also being live streamed on YouTube, the lecture will continue to be available for the public through the class YouTube page after the event. And please, those of you who are watching live online right now, please send your questions or your comments on the YouTube chat, and I will make sure that I convey them to our speaker in the Q&A session. I will be monitoring the chat over there. For those of us who are here at Stanford, I do want to remind us that we are here in the territory and the land of the Ohlone original peoples. I want to offer our gratitude to this land, this water, and this air that surrounds us, and pay our respects to the past, to the present, and to the future of the Ohlone peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout the diasporas. And wherever you happen to be, I would just encourage you to try to learn a little bit about the original occupants of those probably unceded lands where you happen to be. Mareike Winchell today is she's our guest here at Stanford. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on the racialization of property in light of ongoing histories of indigenous land dispossession and how such formations find new expression in contemporary engagements with climate change. Her first book, After Servitude, Elusive Property, and the Ethics of Kinship in Bolivia, University of California Press, just come out, traces the ways in which Quechua people in central Bolivia call upon and actively repurpose the past in their efforts to navigate legacies of labor subjection and sexual violence. Winchell's writing and digital scholarship has appeared in numerous journals, and I'm very happy that we can discuss some of her recent work and this very important topic. So thank you, Mareike. Please.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Alberto and to Sarah and others for helping to facilitate my visit. So I'm speaking about a book that came out in 2022 with California. And my discussion today will really try to center sort of some of the material that made its way into the book. I'm going to focus on storytelling the most. So if you're interested in sort of the heavy theorization of some of this material, I welcome you to read the introduction, which is available actually on my academia page free of charge, so check it out. On a temperate afternoon in February 2012, I ascended the slippery cobblestones off the main street in Independencia, a small town in the rural province of Chaya, Bolivia. Continuing along a muddy road, I arrived at the lush croplands of Flora Montan, the daughter of a former hacienda landlord or patron. Flora was in her 70s and spoke both Quechua and Spanish. I had been invited to her annual Chaya de Terrenos, a gathering centered on the sacrifice of an animal, usually sheep, llama, or bull, and typically performed in the fecund, rainy months following Carnival. The Chaya began in late morning when Flora and her sons, municipal and union officials, villagers, and townsfolk gathered together on a green hillside amid fields of corn, beans, and squash. Earlier that day, a sheep had been sacrificed, its blood distributed across agrarian plots and storage buildings, an offering to the Pachamama or Earth Mother, which, people explained, would ensure crop fertility and family health for the year to come. The meat of the sheep, along with potato and corn, was then baked in traditional pampakkoy or earth oven style, buried atop burning embers and then covered with stones. Beside the earth oven, a small fire was prepared, the koa offering consisting of coca leaves, confetti, incense, and the heart of the sacrificed sheep, all wrapped carefully in paper, was then laid in the middle of the fire. As the koa burned, Flora's sons distributed coca, chicha beer, and cigarettes, and guests stood around solemnly chewing coca and dripping chicha on the burning embers. Later, women guests aided Flora as she doled out steaming plates of sheep meat, potatoes, and corn. The event was attended by a wide array of people, including townsfolk and the resident anthropologist, me, as well as rural Quechua villagers, among them the kin of people who had labored as unpaid tenant farmers and indentured servants for Flora's father, the hacienda landlord. Indeed, the guests included Flora's half-sister, whom Flora had informally adopted after the child was born out of wedlock in the hacienda. After the meal, a bonfire was built up, and Flora's two sons retrieved their guitars and charangos, serenading guests in Quechua and Spanish. At sundown, I joined a group of guests as they carried corn stalks on their shoulders to Flora's chicha brewery in town. There, the music making continued, with lively cueca song lasting until dawn. Each year, during the spring chayas, and can everyone see that image, or should we maybe flip off one of these lights? I do have a
one of this side.
Just saying.
Thank you.
Each year during the spring chayas, the kin of former landlords, servants, and tenant farmers gathered together to drink chicha and consume meat baked in pampacoy ovens. As suggested by the very materiality of the practice, in central Bolivia, the chayas bring together people with very divergent orientations to the region's divisive past. On this occasion, the kin of landlords and unpaid servants alike collect upon former hacienda plots, consuming food cultivated on this land and then roasted in its muddy depths. In the Andes, the seasonal gatherings originated as ritualized acts of tribute payment to colonial hacienda landlords, culminating with a competitive practice in which multiple labor parties vied to deliver produce to the town home of the patron. Of course, as anthropologists have long noted, such gatherings also integrate pre-colonial elements, including poa offerings and ritualized chaya drinking, long central to Andean mining economies, and of course repoliticized under the movement towards socialism government, which I'll be talking about later today. These gatherings facilitate multiple forms of exchange across time and space, drawing together families of former hacendados and colonos or laborers, as well as other than humans said to reside in rock formations, lakes, and rivers. This tradition's entanglement with the region's history of severe hacienda violence contrasts sharply from purist ideals of indigeneity that have guided dominant strands of revivalist nationalism and which continue to guide many theorizations of Andean and Amazonian ontologies. Bolivia's haciendas grew out of colonial encomiendas first founded in 1645, providing land and tribute to Spanish administrators, merchants, and imperial elites. Those in the Cochabamba region, where Ayupaya is situated, were small farms owned by Mestizo landlords and what are called in Quechua small bosses, huchoy patrones, Quechua field hands who had bought land and thereby escaped servitude, so manumission to some degree. Alongside tenant farming, the system was built upon the domestic labor of unmarried women, widows, and girls. During rotating mitani service, women prepared food, cleaned, wove, brewed chicha, fed animals, and cared for children, including the master's children, servant children, and what were known as adoptees. The region was famous for the ubiquity of what were called unnatural sexual abuses and landlords' tight control over labor conditions which fomented widespread anti-hacienda uprisings in Ayupaya in 1947. This was the only 20th century armed rebellion in Cochabamba preceding Bolivia's socialist revolution of 1952. Following national land reform in 1953, most estate land was redistributed or abandoned. However, severe racialized hierarchies persist, assuming new shape in paid domestic labor and mining work. Into the present, many hacendado families live and work in the region, their agriculture supplemented by small-scale mining of gold, antimony, and sodalite. In the book After Servitude, I examine ethical disagreements about how to remedy violent labor pasts. In the aftermath of President Evo Morales' election as Bolivia's first indigenous president in 2005, Flora's Chaya and the hierarchical relations it marks and reproduces might seem anachronistic, something that should have been uprooted by the 1952 socialist revolution or Morales' presidency. As I discuss further, it was largely in such terms the government officials made sense of Ayupaya, a region long identified with the tragic subjection of Quechua-speaking laborers whose entrenchment in the former hacienda system rendered them pressing targets of state intervention. And yet, Flora's Chaya also attests to the existence of specific orientations to the region's bonded past, ones that are noteworthy in their direct, even intimate engagement with the problem of how to live together given a shared history of violence. Along with sponsoring Chayas, Flora acted as a godparent, adopted children, and funded local municipal projects, and distributed food, clothing, and money to former servant families from the tables of her rundown chicharia, or a chicha brewery. And while these exchanges unfolded along various axes of economic and racialized difference, they also drew people together across those differences, supplying a relational medium and a recognition of outstanding debts to former servants. In this regard, Chayas like these point to specific orientations to the hacienda system, ones that suggest a distinct answer to the problem of collective life after violence. While state officials viewed these relations with disdain as colonial survivals, Chaya sponsorship and related relations of exchange were not simply effects of passive historical recursion. Rather, arrangements like these were actively cultivated, both by the kin of landlords and servants. Flora had sponsored the construction of a new Quechua cultural center, as well as adopting, as I mentioned before, 2 girls who were born after her father raped a Quechua servant, or mitani, in the household. For Flora, this act responded to a sense of sadness about the family's mistreatment of workers. As Flora's son put it, it was through such acts that Flora had sought to fulfill a sense of moral obligation to those mistreated by her father. In a rare moment where such sensibilities were made explicit, a Quechua man reprimanded the son of the landlord for being stingy, noting that since the landlords, the patrones, had been so cruel, their children have to be better. Such agrarian-based arrangements of aid originated in the hacienda system, but they were also enacted as a privileged form by which to collectively address past violence and enduring inequalities. To attend to these active engagements with Ayupaya's violent labor past, After Servitude undertakes an ethnography of history. It focuses on the range of ways that Bolivians sought to address a divisive past, including through relations of informal land gifting, adoption, and the circulation of money, resources, medicine, and aid from the families of former hacienda masters to servants. I name this condition after servitude, after simultaneously connoting sequential ordering, a pursuit, a continual following, in the style or imitation of, commemorative naming, and in accordance with the nature or desires of another thing. That Ayupayans carried and negotiated this history through acts of mourning, memorialization, and care for the dead points to the multiple lives of after-ness. In this process, intimate ties and affects emerged as crucial devices for negotiating and renegotiating violence stemming from earlier colonial labor regimes. Through relations among people and to more than humans, as well as to land as a site of temporal overlay or sedimentation, Ayupayans engaged history less as a series of epochs to be overcome, but rather as a series of cross-cutting or interwoven threads that could be cultivated to transform the present. Renewed attention to the multiple lives of after-ness illuminates the messy relational knots through which Bolivian histories of sexual and labor violence are inherited, challenged, and remade. These knots, as I call them, like tying a knot, are analytic devices, but they spring from people's varying efforts to direct and redirect attachments across time and space. For instance, agrarian lands were dotted by the ruins of earlier hacienda buildings, with adobe and wood fragments testifying to a recent oppressive past. However, this did not foreclose farmers' efforts to remake these places into something new, both by planting young fruit trees and by allowing time to weather and break down the old adobe formations. Where the old structures now once stood, young eucalyptus trees slowly grew. After Servitude considers such knotting as a way of imagining, but also demanding attachment, insisting that people remain bound to and beholden by history in ways they might not necessarily want. Unlike the imagery of assemblages from Deleuze and Guattari or friction from Anna Singh, knots emphasize connections as partial outcomes of ongoing efforts to maintain attachments to place and to history. These knots, unlike more common ideas of historical ruins, were not just things ordinary people found or were left with. They were a doing and an active binding. Recalling the English language phrase to be tied down, I use this figure of knotting to draw together a range of practices of historical refashioning. Using such a knot conferred local people both with possibilities for drawing and renewing lines of attachment and obligation across landscapes, but also for critically assessing people in positions of economic and political power. I'm just going to take a sip of water. I have a row back. My talk today begins by describing Bolivia's agrarian reform program, with its indebtedness to earlier state projects of installing property and citizenship. For reform officials, the stakes of land retitling rest not only on achieving technocratic transparency, but also privilege property as a mechanism of historical redress. After discussing the institutional dimensions of agrarian reform and the moral stakes of land titling for officials, I shift back to Ayupaya and to the question of how the region's hacienda past inflects contemporary relations both to land and to the Mas-ruled state. I look at the practices by which land is produced as more than property and consider how such spatialized agrarian sensibilities arise not only as reform objects, but also as a mode by which rural Ayupayans reckon with ongoing injuries related to the past and to unwelcome state interventions. The final section returns to the sacrificial logics of the Chayas, highlighting the unexpected ways that emplaced orientations to collectivity and future shape municipal politics. In closing, I consider the possibilities of after-ness as a mode of claim-making born of acknowledging constitutive entanglements with servitude pasts. So let's start. So first, let's consider the Bolivian government's agrarian reform program, which I should note, formally began in 2006 and is ongoing in with some noteworthy continuities from the Morales period, even though President Arce is now currently president in Bolivia. When I arrived in Bolivia to begin long-term fieldwork in 2010, the initial period of euphoria accompanying the election of Morales seemed to be waning. Mass protests challenged state cuts in food and gas subsidies in January 2011. These were followed by a nationwide conflict hinging on the construction of a road through protected regions of the Eastern Lowlands or Teepnis Reserve in September 2011. Growing dissatisfaction with these Mas policies were also apparent in rural views of the state's agrarian reform program, historically the cornerstone of late colonial and early Republican projects of converting hacienda peasants into rights-bearing citizens. In the Cochabamba province, early Republican land titling initiatives were coupled with aggressive attempts to transform agrarian lifeways and indigenous habits. For instance, as Brooke Larson has talked about, land rights were contingent in some cases on building well-ventilated houses. Right? So this is like intimate habits and not just sort of land rights. Right? Such initiatives figured rural lives as grotesque in their abjection and vulnerability to hacienda subjection. As in the earlier Bourbon reform period, movement towards socialism or Mas reformers at the time of my fieldwork viewed land retitling as a principal mechanism by which to intervene in and thereby improve rural life, introducing more equitable property relations and preventing labor subjection. The current agrarian reform began in 2006 and is overseen by the National Institute for Agrarian Reform, or INRA. The reform includes land retitling, legal aid, institutional support for land collectivization, and new labor protections. And we here see an image. This is from the INRA website of women who have received titles to land through this program. While these efforts continue projects of indigenous land collectivization and land sanitation, or saneamiento, rationalization, initiated in 1996, they are modeled on earlier reforms, primarily the redistribution of hacienda lands in 1953. And I actually did work with the Indra Institute in their archive and with their process of creating new land titles. Land retitling initiatives drew in particular on mid-century agrarian files, or expedientes, I have a picture of this, as models for reform. Organized into titling brigades, there's a titling brigade, Indra officials visit rural regions in order to title property and ensure that land use aligns with these mid-century agrarian surveys. These efforts are accompanied by information campaigns explaining the procedure in Quechua or Aymara and encouraging women to add their names to the titles. Later, Indra technicians overlay current land use patterns with original cartographic maps of colonial parcels. So here, I think there's a pointer, we can see these round parts are individuated, estimated land by individual tenant farmer, and that became then, these survey maps became the basis for land redistribution in 1953. So property is literally sort of like a synthesis of the accrued labor in that place from the hacienda system. And where there's an alignment between the contemporary land use and these earlier survey maps, that land is defined by Indra as legitimate and can be titled. So it's sort of like a testing of the present to the past. Like earlier reforms, mass agrarian initiatives were focused not only on property titles, but also on rural labor relations. A 2008 amendment to the reform law included a supreme decree focused specifically on countering servitude. Article 2 of the amendment empowered land reform officials to, quote, reverse haciendas with systems of servitude and to liberate captive families. The law went on to define servitude as, quote, any servitude arrangements, forced labor, debt peonage, or slavery to families or persons who give services to the owner or land title holder of the land. Finally, Article 4 noted that any, quote, psychological pressure or deception by violent means shall be considered a case of servitude relations. As in the late colonial era, here agrarian reform, particularly land titling, has assumed critical importance as a means to eradicate Indigenous subjection. And as I discuss in the book, one of the difficulties, here's one more picture of land parcels. One of the difficulties with this, of course, is that there have long existed, as scholars like Jessica Lyman Weaver describe, right, relations of informal adoption or labor within families that are not paid, so therefore would meet the criteria for servitude according to the agrarian reform law. And now my blank slides are on purpose, so I'm distracted. Don't worry, it's broken. While conducting fieldwork at the Indra branch in Cochabamba in 2011, I learned about the stakes of land retitling for officials themselves. Mr. Arpasi and I sat in his spacious office on the 4th floor of the Indra Institute. A lawyer by training, Mr. Arpasi was in his mid-30s and spoke Spanish and Quechua fluently. Titling is important, he began, because rural peasants don't use documents to account for property. This causes irregularities in ownership and limits the government's ability to subsidize agricultural losses. He continued, as President Morales said while distributing titles, the land has to have its identification document, just like people do. In addition, Mr. Arpasi argued that titles would help resolve internal conflicts. By way of personal property rights, he explained, you can clean up a parcel. In accordance with this view, land with a valid title is clean, and a clean parcel is free of conflict. Conversely, rural land conflicts are seen as products of inexact property relations stemming from the hacienda era, Mr. Arpasi explained. In some places, people still will not touch the lands of the patron, even though he left years ago. Only after we arrive and tell them that the land is theirs will they use the land. Otherwise, they say, how could I? This belongs to the patron. They respect this. By converting land into property, then, agrarian reformers hope to purify place of the stain of colonialism. In this way, not only remapping land, but also displacing lingering hacienda sensibilities and affects, including that of respect. Despite these reconciliatory aims, however, new titling initiatives, introduced at this time and ongoing, have been accompanied by surging land conflicts, including union efforts to appropriate land from the relatives of Indigenous hacienda servants. According to rural villagers, such clashes have been unusual before Morales' election. Indeed, when I asked Mr. Arpasi, he too argued that such conflicts were relatively new. As he put it, yes, it's true. People say that before Indra arrived, they did not have a single problem, but now they have problems. Before, they did not have property rights. They were planting on what they had inherited, and they made their own documents. With land sanitation, there are problems and conflicts that we have to regulate. Among such problems, he explained, are cases of land with multiple owners. For this reason, he continued, quote, we regulate and perfect. We make declarations and we resolve these problems. Despite acknowledging the destabilizing effects of reform, then, officials continued to frame land regulation as a means to regulate, perfect, adjudicate, and resolve internal conflicts. Rural groups, however, often rejected land titling as the magnanimous act that reformers intended. In a formal statement calling for the suspension of land regulation or land titling in 2011, rural union groups in Ayutthaya warned that state attempts to regulate and intervene in rural land relations risked a, quote, return to colonialism. In addition, and speaking specifically to a proposal for land collectivization, leaders decried the danger of, quote, being managed like a park. Others in Ayutthaya were opposed to land reform not only because of the constraints imposed by state-sponsored land collectivization, but also due to broad skepticism concerning the liberating effects of governmental reform. For instance, the child of hacienda laborers noted bitterly, in Bolivia, the reforms have never been to the benefit of the peasant. Here, indigenous Ayuthayans contested reformist claims that binding land to titles would secure justice, a notion of justice that, as in the case of collective land initiatives, was rooted in government efforts to revive a collective indigeneity thought to have survived unaltered by the nation's colonial past. And that's a separate chapter where I really focus on sort of the opposition to land collectivization in this region. Interestingly, INRA officials admitted that land retitling had been complicated by mistrust, desconfianza, toward INRA. When I asked Mr. Arpasi, he explained that such mistrust was a result of, quote, lacking information. For instance, he recounted, sometimes we are in rural parts explaining and they do not understand. It's like they're in the first grade. So we have to explain 4 times in different ways. And afterwards, they still don't understand. It's like this. He gestured at his blank computer screen. Nothing, nada. So because of this, it is difficult. They belong to another generation. Here, Mr. Arpasi's comments highlight the paternalistic dimensions of Mas reform, in which opposition to land sanitation was explained away as an effect of old age, ignorance, or continued oppression. In the rest of our conversation, Mr. Arpasi described reformers' frustrated attempts to transform entrenched hacienda sensibilities. As he explained, it's not just that the patrones left. People complain to us, this patron did this, and we say, but there are no patrones anymore. It's not the patron, but rather his son or grandson, but people still think like this. Former hacendado subjects were likened to grotesque children, unaware of their own subjection, and even, it seemed, of their broader historical condition. This view recalls earlier colonial typologies of racialized difference. However, under Mas, the aspirational political subject is not the modern Mestizo, so much as the awakened indigenous citizen, one whose vigilance guards against continued coloniality, though not on the part of the state. For agrarian reformers, then, land redistribution arose as a key modality with which to combat entrenched indigenous oppression, documents assuming importance as liberating agents. Much like earlier land titling initiatives, for instance, the 1874, quote, law of unchaining the peasant communities, land titles arose at the time of my fieldwork as a crucial mode by which to uproot lingering structures of hacendado authority and Mestizo property ownership. However, by describing land conflicts and popular mistrust toward Indra as a product of lacking political consciousness, reform officials systematically disavowed rural opposition to the state. Arguments of subjection and historical entrenchment then worked to further legitimize state intervention. While jarring, officials felt that rural peasants would eventually come to appreciate the benefits of agrarian reform. Mr. Arpasi explained, I am from the countryside, from a region that had haciendas. We had to walk an hour and a half to school each day. Today, there are better schools. Things are changing. Before, people were used to accepting projects, of being told what they needed. Now, they have to decide for themselves. This is a big change, and often they object. Yet in the end, they are pleased with it. They say, we didn't have this before. Through land titling, then, reform officials hope to imbue Quechua peasants with new critical capacities that might distinguish them from their grandparents, los abuelos, who labored on haciendas and called the landlord Taitai, my father. So I'm here trying to point to the difficulty, right, of these scenes of bringing a vision of peasant justice, indigenous justice to the countryside, and the systematic ways that that sort of magnanimous gesture reproduces features of long colonial narratives that disavow sort of the reason and critical consciousness to rural people and indigenous people in particular. So one of the things that interests me as well is the ways that this instituting of agrarian land titles also rendered illegible other moral and political claims. The injuries produced by governmental reform deemed necessary within a broader arc of national justice whose benefits would only be evident afterwards. And I'm thinking here of Deb Thomas's notion of expectancy. What are the injuries sanctioned through a logic of sort of eventual benefit, right? So with this institutional background, then I want to return to Ayupaya and the question of how the region's hacienda past shapes land relations today. Pavel was in his early 40s, the grandson of Quechua-speaking herders or forastero populations who had later come to oversee a nearby hacienda. His parents had inherited several fertile plots, having been favored servants. Throughout his life, Pavel cultivated these lands until in 2008 he left for Spain, seeking work in the construction industry in order to support his wife, a local chicha brewer, and his 3 young daughters. Yet it was hard to procure work there, and he returned home in 2011 in financial ruin. He set about preparing his land to plant chirimoya, a coveted tree fruit for which the region is famous, and which you can start getting at grocery stores here, a green, sweet fruit. After several months preparing the soil for planting, a process that required the arduous labor of removing stumps and trees and leveling the soil, all without a tractor, the land was ready for planting. But then the local peasant union intervened. In accordance with Article 76 of the 2006 law, lands left unattended for 2 or more years fail to serve a, quote, social and economic function and are susceptible to state or union repossession and redistribution. Citing this law, another family insisted that the land was theirs, thereby laying claim to the plots that Pavel had so tenderly prepared. One morning, I accompanied Pavel and his uncle on a drive to their former lands. After parking the rusty Jeep, the 3 of us stood at the mouth of the valley, surveying the agricultural fields below. As we stood, Pavel's uncle pointed to various land parcels, beginning with their place names and then noting their original hacienda owner. To the north, across the valley, was the village of Chupani, a former hacienda whose landlord had left land to Pavel's grandparents in the late 1940s. According to Pavel, the land had been an inheritance acknowledging his grandfather's hard work as a mayordomo, or a manager or hacienda overseer. Upon receiving the land, Pavel's grandfather became the de facto landlord of an existing group of laborers. Such shifting land relations were common in the Cochabamba region, where in the late 19th century, Quechua servants, landless migrants, and herders comprised a nascent class of huchoy patrones, or small bosses. Still standing on the roadside, Pavel went on to outline the details of the conflict concerning his chirimoya orchard. The land had been formally divided with the 1953 reform, at which time the National Revolutionary Movement, or MNR, government had distributed titles by executive decree, thereby making former tenant colonos owners of the land they owned, which we saw on the survey maps earlier. Yet in this case, the recipients of these titles had not worked the land. The man who received the executive title had died, and his children had since left for the Chapare jungle, where they worked as coca farmers and also ran a small gasoline transportation business. According to Pavel, the land was left fallow for 26 years. Critically redeploying the reformist language of social and economic function, and we can talk about the ghost of Locke who inhabits some of these laws. Pavel argued that since the legal owners had abandoned the land, it was natural that he, who had interior claims to it, should be able to work it. After all, he noted, the aim of the 1953 law had been to secure usufruct land rights, its aim evident in the slogan, "The land is for he who works it." Here, then, was precisely a case like the one Mr. Arpasi had noted. one in which land had multiple owners and whose terms of possession were unclear and often at odds with the 1953 reform cartographies. And yet, unlike Mr. Arpasi's characterization, this conflict was not simply the product of an entrenched agrarian order resistant to legal reform. Instead, it reflected the existence of mutual, at times incompatible, conceptions of legitimate land use, ideas that stem not only from the absence of law, but also from the presence of specific orientations to place, rooted in paradigms of informal land gifting, for instance. Indeed, the legal owners were themselves the godchildren of Pavel's father. So I should almost have a kinship chart up here, right? But we see that these are all inheritances through these specific labor regimes, who had received the land as a gift or acknowledgement for his unpaid labor as a mayordomo. Thus, even in cases of land retitling, deliberations over legitimate land use responded not only to mid-century reform law, but also to the historical patterning of labor, kinship, and exchange, and its materialization in property. Counter to Mr. Arpasi's narrative, such conflicts were more than expressions of persisting rural tensions. Instead, they were partly generated by recent reforms. Indeed, Pavel's arrangement had not been problematic until 2011, the year that INRA land titling efforts in Ayutthaya began. With the prospect of acquiring title, the legal owners had returned from Chapare, insisting that the land was theirs. So this suggests that the land titling in itself provides new affordances, new possibilities for property, and in these ways can inflame some of the tensions that I've been describing. When Pavel brought the case to the region's worker union, which the 2006 INRA law made the legal arbiter of rural land conflicts, it was clear the union favored the claims of Pavel's opponents. Pavel defended his claims to the land by noting that the property had been abandoned. The union leader, however, denied this logic, noting that, quote, in this case, social and economic function did not require land cultivation. Instead, he implied the case had to do with the necessity of respecting a prior model of hacienda redistribution. Thus, he noted, quote, they can leave this land fallow for 100 years and it will still belong to them. With this ruling, the union made evident what was otherwise merely implicit in the technicalities of land retitling, the affective and moral stakes of this post-2006 agrarian reform. The ruling drew from a specific notion of the legitimate supplicant bound up in national efforts at decolonization via the distribution of rights and resources to marginalized Bolivians. Such aims required that unionists give priority to the claims of descendants of former colonos, or tenant farmers. Within such a national cartography of legitimate injury, Pavel's appeal was illegible. Despite his Quechua accent, his limited education, his wife's work as a humble chicha brewer, and his family's background as landless forastero migrants, Pavel was beyond the frame of campesino legibility, that is, outside of a nationalist configuration of indigeneity established against former hacienda elites. So there could only be two classes within this imaginary, right? Either the worker or the owners. For, as Pavel put it, the union wants to help peasants, yet for me, they did not make justice. This, he added bitterly, was community justice. Land conflicts like Pavel's highlight the divisive workings of national reform agendas, even in places like Ayutthaya that ultimately ousted the National Agrarian Institute, as I mentioned before they were ousted in 2011. On the one hand, it's easy to understand why rural unionists would prioritize former hacienda colonos' claims. Not only have the unions been established to challenge Mestizo statecraft in the early 20th century, Morales' agenda today, or at that time, hinges on promises of redistributing resources to those indigenous subjects whose unpaid labor sustained earlier colonial extraction upon agrarian estates and mining caverns. And yet, this privileging of former tenant claims reproduced the marginalization of a group of Quechua hacienda servants who had historically been excluded both from state land distribution and peasant movements. As I discuss in the book, 20th century reformers and peasant unionists in Bolivia shared a view of hacienda servants. So here there's servants and tenant farmers. I'm speaking about servants known as mitamis or pongos, right? As beasts of burden, subjects whose dependency on landlords rendered them grotesque and politically unfit. Despite reformers' aims to overcome the inequities of the bonded past, then, land retitling cases like Pavel's demonstrate how hacienda land distinctions rather than being eradicated, were instead being revived as the legal premise for distinguishing among competing claims. Here, subjects with more intimate ties to former landowning families were stigmatized as somehow less authentically indigenous, a compromised condition of hacienda affinity marked in the unionist slur son of a landlord, or hijo del patrón. In this way, reformist conflicts mobilized a reified model of indigeneity that also worked to solidify a generalized category of the non-indigenous that spanned former hacienda elites as well as Quechua servants and their kin, such as Pavel. Pavel's case may seem exceptional, an instance of a disgruntled subject who had benefited from hacienda-based labor hierarchies, yet he was not alone in opposing agrarian reform. For others, it was not simply the risk of land expropriation, but rather a broader concern that, by registering land with the state, more informal community-based control would be displaced, the state arising as judge and arbiter of local land relations. This suspicion toward INRA, the Agrarian Reform Institute, grew out of the region's fraught history as a target of agrarian resettlement and reform. In the 1950s, for instance, parties of engineers arrived to conduct topographic surveys of hacienda lands, the maps that we saw, their mapping efforts paralleling the earlier visitas of hacendado and encomendero elites. In response, villagers chased topographers from the lands, destroying maps and accusing engineers of bribery by landlords. And this is something I found a lot of reference to in the archive, right? It was impossible to carry out the work because of local opposition. In Ayupaya, then, opposition to state reform drew not only from a critique of dispossession based on the re-inscription of hacienda hierarchies, but also from a historically derived awareness of the slippages between record-taking and reform, redistribution, and intervention. Most recently, in 2017, such anti-reform sentiment was evident when hundreds of Ayupaya villagers took to the streets in the city of Cochabamba to challenge a state proposal to include the region in the expanded Parque Tunari Ecological Reserve. But more was at stake in rural opposition to agrarian reform than simply the question of land tenure. The region's hacienda past continued to have severe impacts on soil health, rainfall, and agricultural fertility. During fieldwork, rural farmers often lamented that parcels which had been lush and productive during the hacienda era were now crumbling and dry. Here, histories of agrarian violence and the accompanying failure to honor ritualized relations of offering were assigned significant material effects, both ecological and social. Thus, when one former hacienda village suffered a particularly poor harvest following limited rainfall, villagers described the drought as an effect of intra-community conflict, noting that the village, quote, had not been well together the previous year, a failure marked in the lack of bodies in the annual Patron Saints' Day festival. The gathering had been particularly significant that year, given a slew of disputes that followed from union proposals to convert the village into native collective lands, a designation that would limit former hacienda servants' access to inherited land. While such spatialized sensibilities could act to foil reformist efforts to detach land from history by instituting property, village responses to them were themselves rendered tenuous in the course of reform. So in a sense, the reform program not only led to conflicts about agrarian land titles, but also sort of created fractures or divisions in the sense of practices of devotion and broader sort of ways of answering to the crumbling soils and overuse of the soil from this history of monoculture, as well as pesticide use since the 1960s. INRA reformers and reform laws stigmatized post-hacienda relations of patronage and aid as instances of slavery and indigenous subjection. In this regard, reform processes saw these post-hacienda modes of remediation and address as insufficient and even problematic. In one case, for instance, an elderly former servant sought aid from former landlords for medical care. His requests for assistance, ones that grew out of the kind of long-term relations to landlords that we saw at Flores Chaya, were stigmatized by unionists and former colono families who condemned him as, quote, he who remains a slave. The Chayas addressed this scene of precarity, marked by heightened land conflicts, persisting rural vulnerability, and a growing sense of uncertainty and unease about formal approaches to post-servitude justice. Okay, so having provided sort of outline of the tensions in the land reform initiative and in sort of post-Hacienda relations to place in Ayupaya, I now want to look at the unexpected ways that these rural sensibilities of spatialized belonging shape municipal politics. So I'm trying to think here beyond this antithesis between sort of the state and the local, if you will. In a parking lot above town, 20 of us gather outside the municipal government's garage. 3 tractors are parked to our right, and to the left, several tables and chairs have been placed under an overhang. Union leaders, villagers, municipal officials, and the resident anthropologist. We stand in a circle, a white llama between us. We stand for a moment, and then, moving quietly, 2 men encircle the llama and gently lower it to the ground. One man lifts a knife and starts cutting the llama's neck. The blood is collected into the 2 bowls, the rest forming dark rivulets that stream toward the road, attracting several stray dogs. The mayor and head union leader each take a bowl into their hands, and moving the bowls abruptly, they spill the blood in each direction, leaving red blotches on tractors and trucks. When the bowls are empty, the process is repeated, the men covering an ever greater periphery of space, their abrupt movements punctuated by the phrase hayaya, or Aymara for live. As the afternoon drew on, this phrase took various forms. Long live Bolivia, long live Mas, long live Evo. After dousing the surrounding tractors, trucks, and soil with blood, several men began skinning the animal. They cut carefully so that the fur is removed intact, while others set about removing the heart, which will be placed in the koa offering. When they are done, the mayor, a Quechua man from a nearby village, leads the group in prayer as the koa is burned. His prayer recalled Evo's visit to a nearby village earlier that day. He began, "Today our President Evo came to visit. We offer you this koa so that these projects yield success, so that there will be more proyectos in the future." Don Silvio, a weathered man in a dark sombrero, continued, "This koa is for the Pachamama, asking for help in our municipality and with the process of change," referring here to the proceso de cambio, the formal state platform of like decolonial transformation. The koa includes incense, confetti, cash, anise candy, and coca leaves, as well as the heart of the sacrificed llama. People drop coca leaves and then chicha or trago, rubbing alcohol on each corner, accompanied by an utterance of wishes for the year to come. Another official approach, dripping chicha on the bundle. "To the projects in Rami, may they go well." Afterwards, the men lift the wet bundle and place it into the embers to burn, the color of the ash taken as an omen for the peril or promise of the year to come. As I discussed earlier, chayas constitute acts of offering in an ongoing arc of exchange which mediate relations across time and space, linking differentially situated subjects to non-humans, ancestors, and the Pachamama, understood to control agrarian and ecological health and to respond favorably to ritual gifts and sacrificial offerings. However, Ayupaya's chayas exceed any facile characterization as a primordial or timeless indigenous form, pointing to a mode of sacrificial practice that both draws from and seeks to redress a divisive hacienda past. The municipal chaya, and as we saw with the case of Flora Montana, the municipal chaya adds another fold, suggesting a practice of sacrificial exchange that not only links humans and deities, former landlords and servants, but also rural former hacienda villages and the Mas government. In this chaya, Ayupayans engaged critically with state interventions in rural life and contested Mas aspirations toward a purified indigeneity. And as I've discussed elsewhere, you know what? The final pages of my talk are not printed. 20 to 24, 25, sorry. And as I discussed in the book, one of the things that happened in this event was that people started to ask questions about why the ritual was being done in the way that it was, right? For instance, they asked, why are we saying hayaya? Why are we using anise candy? Is it for sale or what? So there were sort of charges, not necessarily of inauthenticity, but of a critical engagement with the government's effort to assimilate or appropriate ritual practices. And I'm just going to grab my computer really quickly. And from here, it's fine. Just give me 1 second to get settled here.
Sarah's trying to print it, but sorry.
That's okay. I've got it right here. One moment. Okay. All right. So, indeed, even as some participants likely viewed the event as an enactment of a nationalist indigeneity, this event also supplied an occasion for critique of government reform agendas. Following the Chaya, various people raised questions about the validity of the practice. For instance, a Quechua-speaking woman who worked in the municipal government inquired, "Why do we say hayaya?" Her question registered discomfort with the inclusion of a politicized Aymara expression, hayaya or live, at an otherwise Quechua and Spanish language gathering. Another man queried the appropriateness of distributing anise candy, itself a rarity in rural parts. While critical evaluations of the material dimensions of ritual are not uncommon in such events, these questions were noteworthy in their shared concern with the entailments of integrating indigenous practices into government. During my fieldwork, Chaya participants were not the only ones to articulate such concern. For instance, Ricardo, a Quechua man at Indra, likened bilingual education to, quote, extracting a heart and putting it in another body. This crime, he continued, is being committed to us. These various critiques probe the entailments of indigenous nationalism, not simply as the revival of something old, but as the production of something new, that also newly fixed relations to the past and definitions of indigeneity. Here, as for Pavel, the specific forms of entangled belonging generated by Ayupaya's hacienda past supplied people with a visceral awareness of the occlusions of indigenizing reform, with its articulation of a new, more constricted understanding of legible forms of indigeneity. And yet, by allowing those doubts into the spheres of municipal practice, government officials demonstrated a radical willingness to confront the limits of the broader political project to which they belonged. In this regard, in their embodied enactment, forms aligned with the indigenous were materially compromised and polluted by that which they were not. An entanglement that supplies a key site from which rural subjects grappled with the possibilities and limits of decolonizing reform. Thus, while both the agrarian Chayas that we began with and national land sanitation sought to address the problem of the hacienda past, so I'm suggesting both this purification of land through ritual and through the purifying form of property, both addressed sort of the question of the legacy of the hacienda. They worked through this problem in divergent ways. For Indra officials, for justice to be attained required that hacienda-era attachments be overcome. For rural villagers and municipal officials, it was necessarily through the recrafting of inherited forms of collectivity and exchange that claims could be made not only on aging hacienda masters, ancestors, or the Pachamama, but also upon the Mas party state. So there's almost like a local appropriations of these forms of sacrifice as sites of critique of the state. Concluding thoughts. By illuminating the various ways that Ayupayans creatively inhabit ongoing imperial formations, after servitude is meant as a provocation to take seriously modes of historical playmaking that chafe up against rights-based paradigms of freedom premised on the autonomy of bodies and subjects from one another and from the past. This allows us to rethink what history is, for whom it operates, and to what ends. Doing so, I argue, expands the scope of the legibly political in ways that do not remain unnecessarily circumscribed by masculinist fantasies of liberal agency that see dependencies principally as constraints. This effort to rethink the possibilities of relational entanglements resonates with recent works in critical Indigenous and Black studies, such as Kim Tallbear's insistence on thinking about how kinship can be extended to settler relations to make new demands on the present, or Zakiya Iman Jackson's work on Black humanity and the racialized figure of the beast or animal, which are very much like haunting these discussions about beasts of burden and so on. What politics inhabit this underbelly to normative textures of liberal optimism? the places where citizenship is not experienced as liberatory so much as another disciplinary intervention? Can anti-colonial justice become a normative project, and with what dehumanizing effects? At the same time, the book shows how rural Ayupayans mobilize the region's agrarian past as a source of governmental critique, to challenge reformers' views of history as only corrosive, as only sort of a negative force. More than reflections of ignorance or old age, widespread opposition to land reform projects at that time should be located within centuries of contested state intervention, histories that accumulate in unexpected ways, sedimenting to produce places and people at odds with state ideals of cleansed property and purified indigeneity. Thus, while INRA officials attribute former hacienda peasants with a sort of childlike pre-political naivety, Quechua subjects in Ayupaya were actually much more cynical of the possibilities of state reform than their urban peers. Far from passive hacienda ruins, then, post-hacienda life was shaped by specific practices of land use and exchange, whose targeting by the state rendered them politicized sites of post-hacienda critique and refusal. Yet, as the Chayas suggest, these former hacienda parcels are not only sites of intervention and critique, they are also the materialities with and through which alternate orientations to historical injustice unfold. If reformers strove to upend the hacienda's grip, it was history's hold on the present that revealed the injuries both of a bonded labor past and of a reformist present that reproduced forms of disavowal, right, that had organized colonial projects of uplift. Such engagements point to the reckonings with what Ronaldo Walcott calls the long emancipation, one in which juridical processes of installing freedom as an emptying of the subject remain incomplete and fragile. Rather than living that obstruction merely as failure or blockage, Quechua Ayupayans recast it as a point of insight into the limits to formal approaches to rights-based justice and as an opening to alternate ways of spatializing struggle. Farmers in this region have long struggled against Mestizo mastery while insisting on forms of emplacement that do not subscribe to what Mark Rifkin calls the trajectories of allotment, including the arrangements of land titling undergirding hacienda land redistribution and more recent land titling efforts. Instead, Ayupayans evoked attachments to places and to itinerant histories of labor mobility, forastero, the migrant labor, that exceed accounting by recognition-based models of bounded collectivity. This suggests how, against national programs that liken communities of former hacienda servants to animals, human beasts, or the walking dead, or computer screens, Ayupayans inhabited beholdenness as an urgent call to action and to continue crafting and recrafting life within landscapes of dispossession. I'm almost done. Ayupayans' efforts to recast abiding hierarchies and attachments indicate that political life is neither as constrained nor as determinate as we might have imagined. In this image of the basement of a former hacienda, we might retrain our eyes to see not only a shadowy structure, the interior of the hacienda abandoned to time, but also a material space that supplies the shared ground from which people act and live together today. Indeed, upon closer scrutiny, we see not only rusted coils of barbed wire, the residue of projects of enclosure and dispossession that link the hacienda system and current agrarian reforms, but also newly constructed adobe slabs used by herders and agriculturalists as seats upon which to rest during coca chewing breaks or pichados. It is in the hacienda's ruins that rural subjects attempt to carve out habitable lives, responding both to the burdens of a violent past and to the injuries of a state reformism that renders those very habitations inadequate. In short, it is precisely the imperfect cleansing of past that undergirds these contemporary acts of playmaking and critique. Rather than decry history's imperfect displacement, I have asked what such after-ness can teach us about the limits to our analytics of political action, as well as our own equally entrenched ideas of the just. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So we open to questions.
people usually stand up there? Or
We'll maybe take one question still broadcasting,
Okay.
and then we'll probably have to interrupt the live cast, because we try to keep it on an hour. So, questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I have two questions. One, I think, related to the idea that lands used to do much better under the haciendas, and they were kind of crumbling after that. And I was wondering if you could speak more to the mechanisms under that. So how does the Green Revolution going on at the same time kind of come into that? And the second question, how do you see the relation between a collective notion of land rights to these notions of individual property rights that are needed for land titling? And then
Great, thank you. I mean, on the first question, I talk about this a little bit in a piece for comparative studies in society and history. And I mean, I think on the one hand, there's an exhaustion of soil from monoculture, right, from planting the same thing over and over. In addition, there was an introduced use of pesticides from, I think, like the late 60s, 70s onward by the relatives of hacienda owners. So there's this continuity across like what we can think of as the history of the plantationocene, right? Monoculture, ecological sort of devastation and disease from the limiting to one crop, and the Green Revolution and the ways that further contributed to sort of the crumbling of soil. I would also add climate change. This is a place where drought and climate change is being actively sort of talked about, discussed, worried about, as well as what we can think of as sort of non-secular orientations to land. Like what does it mean to link something like soil health to the capacities for collective devotion? So these are things that all sort of come together in this space. And on your second question, I mean, part of the argument that I make in this book is that as much as we might like it to be otherwise, many of these collective land titling projects sort of mimic the logics of property. They require that territory subscribe to municipal boundaries. They require the eradication of any like inherited titles that people have for this new form of territory. And scholars like Penelope Antias, who writes about the lowlands, have sort of looked at how unfamiliar actually many of the sort of state logics of bound territory are. In my own book, in this book, I have a chapter where I talk about like anxieties with territory that emerge as people are using multiple parcels. So if, as archaeologists of the Andes are surely familiar, there was this Mi'kmaq system. So people had like the vertical archipelago, people would use land across different regions. And haciendas often mimicked that, which meant that then the laborers were working land down in the valley, where there was cocoa growing, and in between in the mountains where it's green, there were peaches, and up high they were growing potatoes, right? And that kind of configuration can't make its way into this single person, single property arrangement, and neither can it be accommodated for through the territorial projects, right? Which also sort of presume a delimited single space of territory that needs to be closed off from what is outside of it.
I will end the broadcast part of our lecture, and we will continue the conversation here in the room. But before I do that, I do want to thank Sara Clemente always for deftly, figuring out the ways to have our broadcast happen. Also, the Department of Anthropology for this invitation, for Professor Mareike Winchell for sharing her expertise with us today. And I do want to remind you, we do not have lectures in the next 2 Fridays, but we're back on March 3rd with Professor Odilia Romero, who's going to talk about territoriality of indigenous peoples, actually in Los Angeles. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now you can come and sit.
Okay.
Oh.